Commander Zethrix had seen the face of death more times than most beings in the galaxy could count. His metallic blue skin bore the scars of 100 battles, each mark telling a story of survival against impossible odds. The Cortharian military had shaped him into their finest warrior, and his reputation preceded him across 17 star systems. He commanded respect from allies and struck fear into the hearts of enemies. Yet today, as he stood on the bridge of his flagship Eternal Victory, something felt different. The holographic display before him showed a small blue-green planet orbiting a yellow star in what the galactic community had designated as Sector 7741. Intelligence reports indicated this world harbored a species that had recently achieved faster-than-light travel. Standard protocol demanded immediate contact and assessment. Most primitive civilizations either submitted to the Galactic Confederation's authority or were swiftly conquered if they proved hostile. It was a system that had worked for millennia. Zethrix studied the preliminary scans with professional interest. The planet's inhabitants called themselves humans, and their technology appeared laughably primitive compared to Confederation standards. Their ships moved slowly, their weapons seemed crude, and their military organization looked chaotic at best. The commander felt a familiar mixture of boredom and mild curiosity. Another backwater species to catalog and either recruit or subjugate. Lieutenant Corvin approached with additional intelligence reports clutched in his four-armed grip. The young Vorthan officer had served under Zethrix for 3 years and had learned to read his commander's moods with remarkable accuracy. Today, however, he seemed nervous about something beyond the usual pre-contact jitters. "Sir, the cultural analysis team has completed their assessment of human civilization," Corvin reported, his voice carrying an undertone of uncertainty that made Zethrix's sensory antennae twitch with attention. "Summarize their findings," Zethrix ordered, though his eyes remained fixed on the tactical displays showing human ship movements around their homeworld. Corvin consulted his data pad, his secondary arms trembling slightly. "The humans appear to be a highly aggressive species, sir. Their recorded history shows nearly constant warfare among their own kind. They've developed an enormous variety of weapons and military tactics, often creating new methods of destruction faster than they advance in other sciences." This caught Zethrix's attention. Aggressive species weren't uncommon, but few focused so intensely on warfare that it dominated their development. "What else?" "Their concept of surrender appears limited, sir. In many documented conflicts, human forces have continued fighting even when facing certain destruction. They seem to prefer death over submission in numerous cases." Corvin paused, consulting another section of his report. "Additionally, they show remarkable adaptation to hostile environments. They've spread across their entire planet, including regions that would be lethal to most species we've encountered." Zethrix finally turned from the displays, his predatory gaze focusing on his lieutenant. Something in the young officer's posture suggested there was more troubling news to come. "Continue." "Sir, there are reports of humans engaging in what they term recreational combat. They voluntarily fight each other for entertainment, sometimes to the death. They also regularly participate in activities that risk severe injury or death simply for the thrill of it." Corvin's voice grew quieter. "The analysis team believes this indicates a species with an unusually low fear response and high pain tolerance." For a moment, Zethrix felt something he hadn't experienced in decades of warfare, genuine unease. He pushed the feeling aside with practiced discipline. Countless species had seemed formidable based on initial reports, only to crumble when faced with superior Confederation technology and tactics. Their military capabilities? Primitive, but numerous, sir. They possess nuclear weapons, though nothing approaching our plasma artillery. Their space fleet consists of perhaps 300 vessels, most designed for system patrol rather than serious combat. Corvin hesitated again. "However, sir, there is one concerning detail." "Speak." "Human military doctrine appears to emphasize what they call asymmetric warfare. They specialize in using inferior forces to defeat superior ones through unconventional tactics. Their history includes numerous examples of smaller, weaker forces defeating much larger, better-equipped enemies." Corvin's 4 eyes met his commander's gaze. They seemed to view such victories as sources of particular pride. Zethrix dismissed this with a wave of his armored hand. Asymmetric warfare was nothing new. Desperate species often attempted creative tactics when facing Confederation forces. None had succeeded. The technological gap was simply too vast. "Have they responded to our diplomatic transmission?" "Yes, sir. They've agreed to meet with a Confederation representative to discuss mutual cooperation and peaceful coexistence. Corbin's tone suggested he found these human words either amusing or naive. The commander nodded, already formulating his approach. Standard procedure called for an initial meeting to assess the species' potential value to the Confederation. Useful races were offered junior membership status, while troublesome or worthless ones faced conquest or elimination. Based on everything he'd heard, humans would likely fall into the latter category. 3 hours later, Zephrix found himself in the diplomatic conference room aboard the human vessel Aurora Dawn. The ship's interior struck him as utilitarian but well-designed, showing attention to both function and durability. What surprised him was the artwork adorning the walls, images depicting humans in various combat scenarios throughout their history. These weren't glorifications of victory, but rather somber tributes to sacrifice and loss. The human delegation consisted of 5 individuals, led by someone they introduced as Admiral Sarah Chun. She appeared to be middle-aged by human standards, with graying hair and eyes that held a depth of experience Zephrix recognized from his own mirror. Her bearing was military, but she carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to command. "Commander Zephrix," Admiral Chun said, rising from her seat as he entered. "Welcome aboard the Aurora Dawn. We're honored to meet a representative of the Galactic Confederation." Zephrix studied the humans carefully as he took his designated seat. They showed no obvious signs of fear or intimidation, despite his imposing 2-meter height and clearly visible weaponry. If anything, they seemed genuinely curious about him and his crew. This casual confidence struck him as either incredibly naive or remarkably bold. "Admiral Chun," he replied, activating his universal translator. "I represent the interests of the Galactic Confederation in this sector. My purpose here is to assess your species' readiness for integration into our community of civilized worlds." One of the human officers, a younger man with multiple scars across his face, leaned forward slightly. "Integration? Could you elaborate on what that would involve?" The question itself was standard, but something in the human's tone suggested he was evaluating Zephrix as much as seeking information. The commander felt his tactical instincts engage. These humans weren't behaving like the typical primitive species he encountered. They weren't overwhelmed by superior technology or intimidated by his reputation. "Integration involves accepting Confederation authority over your species' development and foreign relations," Zephrix explained. "In exchange, you receive access to advanced technology, trade networks, and protection from hostile forces. Many species have found this arrangement beneficial." Admiral Chun exchanged glances with her officers before responding. "And if we prefer to maintain our independence?" The directness of the question caught Zephrix off guard. Most species either eagerly accepted Confederation membership or attempted to negotiate terms. Few asked so bluntly about alternatives. Independence is rarely a viable option for newly spacefaring species. The galaxy contains many dangerous forces that would quickly overwhelm an isolated civilization. "I see." Admiral Chin's expression remained neutral, but Zephrix detected a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The humans had tensed almost imperceptibly, not with fear but with the focused alertness of experienced soldiers recognizing a threat. And these dangerous forces, would they include the Confederation itself? Now Zephrix felt definitely unsettled. The human admiral had just asked, in polite diplomatic terms, whether the Confederation would attack Earth if humanity refused membership. It was a question that demonstrated both intelligence and courage. Most species either didn't think to ask or were too frightened to voice their suspicions. "The Confederation seeks peaceful integration wherever possible," Zephrix replied carefully. "However, we cannot permit hostile or chaotic forces to threaten galactic stability." The scarred human officer spoke again. "So our choice is submission or conquest." The bluntness was stunning. Zephrix had participated in hundreds of first contact scenarios, and none had proceeded with such direct confrontation of uncomfortable truths. These humans weren't playing diplomatic games or clinging to naive hopes about galactic brotherhood. They understood exactly what the Confederation represented and were forcing an honest discussion of their situation. "That is a crude but essentially accurate assessment," Zephrix admitted. He found himself respecting their refusal to waste time on polite fictions, even as it complicated his mission. Admiral Chin nodded slowly. "Thank you for your honesty, Commander. It's refreshing to deal with someone who speaks plainly." She leaned back in her chair, her posture still relaxed but her eyes sharp. "Now, Before we discuss humanity's response to your offer, perhaps you could tell us about your own experiences with conquest and submission? The question hit Zethryx like a physical blow. No species had ever asked him about his personal history during a first contact scenario. The professional distance he maintained was being deliberately eroded by this human's unexpected approach. I don't understand the relevance of such information. Oh, but I think you do. Admiral Chin's voice remained pleasant, but there was steel beneath the courtesy. You see, Commander, we've done our homework. We know about the Cortharian uprising 40 years ago. We know about the siege of Korthak Prime, and the choice your people faced between extinction and servitude. Zethryx felt the blood drain from his facial chromatophores. How could these primitive humans possibly know about that? The Kortharian uprising was classified information, known only to high-ranking Confederation officials and the survivors themselves. Yet this human admiral was discussing it as casually as she might comment on the weather. We know you were a young warrior then, Admiral Chun continued, her voice growing gentler. We know you watched the orbital bombardment of your homeworld's capital city. We know you were among the military leaders who made the decision to surrender rather than watch your entire species be exterminated. The conference room fell silent except for the soft hum of the ship's systems. Zethryx struggled to process what was happening. These humans had somehow obtained intelligence that should have been impossible for them to access. More disturbing still was the way Admiral Chen spoke about his people's defeat, not with mockery or satisfaction, but with what seemed like genuine sympathy. How? Zethryx managed to ask. Admiral Chen smiled sadly. We've been monitoring Confederation communications for longer than you might expect. We've also made contact with several resistance movements in conquered territories. The story of the brave Kortharian officer who chose his people's survival over his own pride has become something of a legend among those who still dream of freedom. Zethryx felt the walls of his professional composure cracking. These humans weren't just primitive newcomers stumbling into galactic politics. They'd been preparing for this encounter, gathering intelligence, and building networks among the Confederation's enemies. They knew exactly who he was and what he represented. The point, Admiral Chun continued, is that we understand your position, Commander. You serve the Confederation not from love, but from necessity. Your people survive because you've proven your value as conquerors. But what happens to a people's soul when they're forced to become the very thing they once fought against? The question struck at the core of Zethryx's deepest fears and regrets. He'd spent 40 years trying to convince himself that serving the Confederation was pragmatic rather than shameful. He'd told himself that helping to conquer other species was necessary to protect his own people. But, late at night, in the quiet moments between campaigns, the faces of those he'd defeated haunted his dreams. You cannot possibly understand our situation, Zethryx said, his voice rougher than he intended. Can't we? The scarred human officer spoke up again. Commander, my name is Colonel Marcus Rodriguez. I've spent the last 15 years fighting in conflicts most people prefer to forget. I've made choices that still keep me awake at night, justified actions that violated everything I thought I believed in. I've watched good people become monsters because circumstances left them no other option. He leaned forward. So when I look at you, I don't see an enemy. I see a fellow soldier carrying burdens he never chose. Zethryx stared at the human in shock. The man was offering understanding rather than condemnation, recognizing the moral complexity of his situation rather than judging him for it. In 40 years of service to the Confederation, no one had ever acknowledged the cost of what he'd been forced to become. Admiral Chin stood and walked to one of the wall displays, gesturing to an image of human soldiers in what appeared to be a desperate last stand. Commander, let me tell you about the Battle of Thermopylae. Over 2,000 years ago, 300 Spartan warriors faced an army of hundreds of thousands. They knew they couldn't win. They knew they were going to die. But they fought anyway, because some things are worth dying for. She moved to another image, this one showing a massive military cemetery. This is Arlington National Cemetery. It holds the remains of hundreds of thousands of humans who died in wars throughout our history. Some of those wars were just, others were not. But every person buried here made the same choice. They decided that freedom was worth whatever price they had to pay. Zethryx found himself studying the images with growing unease. Human military history wasn't just about victory or defeat, it was about sacrifice. These people had a cultural tradition of choosing death over submission that stretched back millennia. The Confederation's standard tactics of intimidation and overwhelming force might not work against a species that viewed martyrdom as preferable to slavery. What are you trying to tell me, Admiral? Zethryx asked. Admiral Chun returned to her seat, her expression serious but not hostile. I'm telling you that humanity has made its choice, Commander. We will not submit to Confederation authority. We will not become another client species in your empire. And we will not allow our world to be conquered without a fight that will make your previous campaigns look like training exercises. The quiet certainty in her voice was more chilling than any threat Zethrix had ever heard. This wasn't bravado or desperation. It was simple statement of fact. These humans would fight, and they would fight in ways the Confederation had never encountered before. You're choosing extinction, Zethrix said, though he was no longer certain that was true. No, Admiral Chin replied. We're choosing to remain human. And sometimes, Commander, that's the only choice that really matters. As Zethrix looked around the conference room at the faces of the human delegation, he realized that everything he thought he knew about warfare was about to be tested. These weren't the primitive savages his intelligence reports had suggested. They were something far more dangerous, a species that had turned suffering into strength and defeat into determination. For the first time in 40 years of military service, Commander Zethrix wasn't certain his side would win. The return journey to the Confederation fleet gave Zethrix time to process the disturbing encounter. His flagship Eternal Victory cut through hyperspace while he sat in his private quarters, staring at the intelligence reports that now seemed woefully inadequate. Everything about the humans defied conventional wisdom about how newly spacefaring species should behave. His communication console chimed with an incoming priority message from High Command. The holographic image of Fleet Admiral Vakris materialized before him, her imposing figure radiating the authority of someone who had crushed a dozen rebellions across 3 galactic sectors. The Zinthari's crystalline features showed no emotion, but Zethrix could read the impatience in her posture. Commander Zethrix, your report is overdue, Admiral Vakris stated without preamble. What is the status of the human integration assessment? Zethrix straightened in his chair, choosing his words carefully. Admiral, the situation is more complex than our initial intelligence suggested. The humans have declined Confederation membership and appear prepared to resist any attempt at forced integration. Admiral Vakris's crystalline features shifted to display what Zethrix recognized as mild amusement. Another primitive species choosing the hard path? How refreshingly predictable. What force will you require for the subjugation operation? Admiral, with respect, I believe a standard subjugation campaign would be inadvisable. The words felt strange coming from Zethrix's mouth. He'd never recommended against military action before, and he wasn't entirely sure why he was doing so now. The humans possessed certain characteristics that could make conquest problematic. Now Admiral Vakris displayed genuine interest. In her 3 centuries of military service, few species had ever been classified as problematic rather than simply resistant. Explain. Zethrix consulted his notes, though he hardly needed them. The details of his meeting with the humans were burned into his memory. The humans demonstrate an unusual cultural attachment to independence and an extremely high tolerance for casualties in pursuit of what they consider moral imperatives. Their history suggests they would choose extinction over subjugation. All species claim they would die before surrendering, Admiral Vakris replied dismissively. Most change their minds when faced with orbital bombardment. Admiral, these humans have been monitoring our communications for years. They know our tactics, our capabilities, and our standard procedures. They've also apparently made contact with resistance movements in several conquered territories. Zethrix paused, knowing his next words would be shocking. They knew classified details about the Cortharian uprising, including my personal involvement. For the first time in their long professional relationship, Zethrix saw Admiral Vakris display genuine surprise. The Cortharian uprising was one of the most closely guarded secrets in Confederation history, known only to the highest levels of command and intelligence. The idea that a primitive species could have accessed such information was almost incomprehensible. That's impossible, Admiral Vakris said, but her tone suggested she was already reconsidering that assessment. I thought so too, Admiral. But they knew details that could only have come from classified military records or direct testimony from survivors. The human admiral knew my rank during the uprising, my homeworld's name, even the specific details of the bombardment that forced our surrender. Zethrix felt his hands clench involuntarily. They've been preparing for contact with us far longer than we realized. Admiral Vakris was silent for several moments, processing the implications. If the humans had somehow penetrated Confederation intelligence networks, the security breach went far beyond a simple first contact scenario. The entire structure of galactic governance could be compromised. What do you recommend, Commander? The question surprised Zephrix. Admiral Vakris rarely asked for tactical advice, preferring to issue orders and expect compliance. But the human situation had clearly entered uncharted territory that demanded creative thinking rather than standard procedures. I recommend a full intelligence assessment before any military action, Zephrix replied carefully. We need to understand how they obtained classified information and what other capabilities they might be hiding. A premature attack could trigger responses we haven't anticipated. Admiral Vakris nodded slowly. Granted, you have 72 hours to conduct a complete intelligence review. If the humans pose a security threat to the Confederation, they will be eliminated regardless of the cost. The communication ended, leaving Zephrix alone with his troubled thoughts. He'd bought humanity 3 days, but he wasn't sure it would be enough. The Confederation had existed for millennia precisely because it eliminated threats before they could grow dangerous. A species that could penetrate classified networks and organize resistance movements would be deemed an unacceptable risk to galactic stability. Zephrix's contemplation was interrupted by Lieutenant Corvin's arrival. The young Vorthan officer appeared even more nervous than usual, clutching what appeared to be an urgent message. Sir, we're receiving a transmission from the human homeworld. It's unusual. Define unusual. The transmission is being broadcast on all Confederation military frequencies simultaneously. It's not directed at us specifically. It's reaching every Confederation vessel in the sector. Corvin's forearms trembled slightly. Sir, the humans are somehow accessing our secured communication networks. Zephrix felt a chill of recognition. The humans weren't just monitoring Confederation communications. They were actively using them. Show me the transmission. The holographic display activated, revealing Admiral Chen standing in what appeared to be a military command center. Behind her, Zephrix could see dozens of human officers working at various stations, while multiple screens displayed star charts and tactical information. The scale of the operation was impressive for a supposedly primitive species. Greetings to all Confederation personnel currently stationed in human space. Admiral Chen began, her voice carrying clearly through the secured channels. I am Admiral Sarah Chun of Earth Defense Command. I'm addressing you directly because your superiors have chosen to classify this message rather than share it with frontline troops who deserve to understand the situation they're facing. Zephrix realized with growing alarm that Admiral Chun was speaking directly to Confederation military personnel, bypassing the command structure entirely. This was psychological warfare of a sophistication he'd never encountered from a newly contacted species. By now, your intelligence services have informed your commanders that humanity has refused Confederation membership. What they haven't told you is that we've been monitoring your communications for over 2 decades. We know about your fleet dispositions, your tactical doctrines, and your standard conquest procedures. We also know about the cost of resistance. The image shifted to show historical footage from various Confederation conquest campaigns. Zephrix recognized several of the battles, including some he'd personally commanded. The humans had somehow obtained detailed records of Confederation military operations across multiple sectors and time periods. We know about the orbital bombardment of Korthak Prime. We know about the plasma storms that sterilized the Yevitha homeworld. We know about the biological weapons deployed against the Zephyrian colonies. Admiral Chen's voice remained calm, but her eyes showed a steel that Zephrix recognized from combat veterans. We know that resistance to the Confederation typically results in extinction. The display changed again, now showing human military installations across Earth and its colonies. Massive defensive structures, underground facilities, and orbital weapon platforms that definitely hadn't existed during the initial intelligence surveys. The humans had been preparing for war on a scale that dwarfed anything the Confederation expected from a newly spacefaring species. However, there are facts about humanity that your intelligence services have failed to grasp. We are not like the other species you've conquered. We have spent our entire evolutionary history at war with our environment, our predators, and ourselves. Conflict isn't something that happens to us. It's who we are. New images appeared, showing human military history throughout the ages. Ancient battles where vastly outnumbered forces achieved impossible victories. Modern conflicts where technological superiority was overcome through determination and innovation. The pattern was consistent across millennia. Humans turned disadvantages into advantages through sheer stubborn refusal to accept defeat. You believe that superior technology and overwhelming force will ensure victory. You believe that threatening our extinction will force our surrender. You believe that we will make the same rational calculations that other species have made when faced with impossible odds. Admiral Chen's smile was cold and predatory. You are mistaken. The transmission shifted to show what appeared to be a massive underground complex filled with human military personnel. The scale was staggering. Thousands of people working in coordinated preparation for a conflict that would determine their species' future. But what struck Zethrix most forcefully was their demeanor. These humans weren't desperate or frightened. They were eager. Let me share some facts about human military doctrine that your analysts may have overlooked. We have a saying, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." Every species you've conquered, every resistance movement you've crushed, every survivor who dreams of freedom, they are our natural allies. You've spent millennia creating enemies. We've spent the last 20 years uniting them. The display changed to show communication logs between Earth and dozens of different star systems. The scope of human diplomatic activity was breathtaking. They'd somehow made contact with resistance movements across the galaxy, establishing networks that had remained hidden from Confederation intelligence. The isolated rebellions that High Command dismissed as minor annoyances were connected by human coordination. We've learned from your victories and studied your defeats. We know that conventional warfare against the Confederation is suicide. But we also know that unconventional warfare has succeeded where direct confrontation has failed. The Andorian insurgency lasted 15 years before you crushed it. The Hegemony War nearly bankrupted your treasury. The Phantom Fleet still operates in the Outer Rim after 8 years of pursuit. Admiral Chen's eyes gleamed with dangerous intelligence. Imagine what coordinated resistance across 50 systems could accomplish. Zethrix realized he was watching the birth of something the Confederation had never faced: organized galactic rebellion. The humans hadn't just refused membership. They'd positioned themselves as leaders of every suppressed species and independence movement in known space. This wasn't just another conquest campaign. It was the beginning of a war that could shatter the existing galactic order. But, perhaps most importantly, Admiral Chen continued, you need to understand what you're asking your own people to do. Commander Zethrix of the Eternal Victory is a decorated Cortharian officer whose homeworld was bombarded into submission 40 years ago. Lieutenant Corvin is a Vorthan whose family died in the pacification campaigns. Major Thren is a Yolani whose entire culture was classified as incompatible with galactic stability and eliminated. The fact that Admiral Chen knew the personal histories of his crew members sent ice through Zethrix's veins. How deeply had human intelligence penetrated Confederation systems? What other classified information did they possess? Look around you. Admiral Chen addressed the transmission directly to the individual soldiers watching. How many of you are serving the Confederation because your species had no choice? How many of you dream of the day when your homeworlds might be free? How many of you hate what you've been forced to become? The psychological warfare was devastating in its precision. Admiral Chen wasn't just threatening military resistance. She was offering hope to the countless conquered species serving in Confederation forces. The potential for mass defection was a nightmare scenario that could collapse the entire imperial structure. Humanity offers you an alternative. We offer you the chance to fight for freedom instead of oppression, to build instead of destroy, to serve your own people instead of your conquerors. We offer you the chance to become who you were before the Confederation turned you into tools of your own people's enslavement. The transmission concluded with a final image, the blue-green world of Earth hanging in space, surrounded by defensive installations and military vessels. But the defenses weren't arranged in the typical patterns of a fortress under siege. They were positioned like a spider's web, with Earth at the center of communications lines reaching out to every corner of the galaxy. The choice is yours, Admiral Chen said. Serve the Confederation and help destroy another free species, or stand with humanity and help liberate the galaxy. Choose wisely. You may not get another chance. The transmission ended, leaving Zethrix and his crew in stunned silence. In less than 15 minutes, the humans had fundamentally changed the nature of their conflict with the Confederation. This was no longer a simple conquest scenario that could be resolved with superior firepower. It was ideological warfare on a scale that threatened the foundations of galactic civilization. Lieutenant Corvin was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. Sir, they knew about my family. Zethrix nodded grimly. The humans knew about all of them, their histories, their losses, their reasons for serving a government they'd never chosen. It was intelligence gathering of unprecedented sophistication, combined with psychological manipulation that cut to the heart of every conquered species' resentment. Sir, Major Thrin approached hesitantly. The Yolani officer had served faithfully for 20 years, but now her usual stoic demeanor showed cracks of uncertainty. What are your orders? It was the question Zethryx had been dreading. As a Confederation officer, his duty was clear: suppress the human rebellion and eliminate the security threat they represented. But, as a Cortharian who remembered the bombardment of his homeworld, whose people served the Confederation only because extinction was the alternative, the choice was far more complex. Maintain position, Zethryx ordered. Continue intelligence gathering operations. Report any unusual activity from human forces. It was a holding action, nothing more. But, for the first time in 40 years, Commander Zethryx found himself wondering if there might be an alternative to endless service in the name of species survival. The humans had offered something the Confederation never could: the possibility of redemption for crimes committed under duress. As his crew dispersed to their duties, Zethryx remained on the bridge, staring at the tactical display showing Earth's defenses. Somewhere on that planet, Admiral Chun and her people were preparing for a war they couldn't possibly win through conventional means. But they weren't planning a conventional war. They were planning something far more dangerous: a war for the soul of the galaxy itself. And, despite 40 years of loyal service to the Confederation, Zethryx found himself hoping they might succeed. Admiral Vakris arrived at the human sector with the Third Fleet 3 days ahead of schedule. Her massive dreadnought Galactic Dominion was accompanied by 200 vessels representing the most advanced military technology in Confederation space. It was a force capable of reducing entire star systems to cosmic dust, and she intended to use it to send a message that would echo across the galaxy for generations. Zethryx received the fleet arrival notification while reviewing intelligence reports that had grown increasingly troubling over the past week. Human communication intercepts showed coordinated activity across dozens of star systems, while Confederation security services reported mysterious equipment failures and data breaches at facilities throughout the Empire. The humans weren't just preparing for their own defense. They were actively sabotaging Confederation operations across multiple sectors. The summons to Admiral Vakris's flagship came within an hour of her arrival. Zethryx transported across to the Galactic Dominion with a sense of foreboding that had only grown stronger since his first meeting with the humans. The massive vessel represented everything the Confederation stood for: overwhelming technological superiority, ruthless efficiency, and the absolute certainty that resistance was futile. Admiral Vakris received him in her command center, a vast chamber filled with holographic displays showing real-time tactical information from across the galaxy. The scale of Confederation military power was staggering to behold, but Zethryx found himself thinking about Admiral Chin's transmission and wondering how many of the beings operating these systems were conquered species serving their conquerors. Commander Zethryx, Admiral Vakris began without preamble, your intelligence assessment has been reviewed by High Command. The human security breach is more extensive than initially believed. They've somehow accessed classified archives dating back centuries and established communication networks with seditious elements across 57 star systems. Zethryx felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. Numbers like that meant only one thing: the Confederation was preparing for total annihilation rather than simple conquest. What are your orders, Admiral? The humans represent an unacceptable threat to galactic stability. They will be eliminated completely. Their homeworld will be sterilized, their colonies glassed, and their entire species erased from existence. Admiral Vakris's crystalline features showed no emotion as she pronounced humanity's death sentence. We begin the bombardment in 6 hours. Admiral, with respect, that may not be advisable. The words came out before Zethryx could stop them. Questioning direct orders from Fleet Command was technically mutiny, but something about the situation demanded resistance. The humans have specifically prepared for orbital bombardment scenarios. They may have countermeasures we haven't anticipated. Admiral Vakris turned her full attention to Zethryx, her expression shifting to display what he recognized as dangerous interest. Are you suggesting that a primitive species could pose a genuine threat to Confederation naval superiority? I'm suggesting that these particular primitives have spent 20 years studying our tactics and preparing specific countermeasures. They've also demonstrated intelligence capabilities that exceed anything in our experience with newly spacefaring species. Zethryx straightened, knowing he was risking his career and possibly his life. I recommend a limited probe attack to assess their defensive capabilities before committing the full fleet. Admiral Vakris considered this for several moments. The suggestion had tactical merit, and even her confidence in Confederation superiority didn't extend to blind recklessness. Very well. You will lead a reconnaissance in force with one battle group, test their defenses, and report their capabilities. The main fleet will follow with full sterilization protocols once we understand what we're facing. 3 hours later, Zethrix led 12 heavy cruisers toward Earth's orbital defenses. His tactical displays showed a defensive network that had grown significantly since his first visit. The humans had constructed massive orbital fortresses at every Lagrange point, deployed thousands of automated defense platforms, and somehow moved several large asteroids into defensive positions around their homeworld. What concerned him most, however, were the things he couldn't see. Human communication intercepts had mentioned surprise packages and special preparations for Confederation forces, but intelligence services had been unable to determine what these references meant. Given humanity's talent for innovation and their detailed knowledge of Confederation tactics, Zethrix suspected they were about to discover something unprecedented. "Sir, we're receiving a communication from the human defenses," Lieutenant Corvin reported from his position at the communications console. His 4 hands moved nervously over the controls as he processed the incoming message. "It's addressed specifically to you, sir." Zethrix accepted the communication on his personal console, unsurprised to see Admiral Chen's face appear on the display. She appeared to be speaking from a heavily fortified command bunker, surrounded by sophisticated tactical displays that showed real-time positions of every Confederation vessel in the system. "Commander Zethrix," Admiral Chen greeted him with what appeared to be genuine warmth. "I was hoping we'd have a chance to speak again before this situation escalated beyond diplomatic resolution." "Admiral Chen," Zethrix replied formally, "I'm here under direct orders to assess your defensive capabilities. This is your final opportunity to surrender and accept Confederation authority." Admiral Chen's expression grew sad, but unsurprised. "I was afraid you'd say that. Commander, before you begin your attack, I want you to understand something important. This isn't just about Earth's defense anymore. This is about the future of every conquered species in the galaxy." Before Zethrix could respond, his tactical officer called out in alarm. "Sir, we're detecting massive energy signatures throughout the system. The humans appear to be activating some kind of network." Zethrix turned to his displays and felt his blood run cold. The asteroids he'd assumed were static defensive positions were moving. Not just moving, accelerating at velocities that should have been impossible for natural bodies their size. Worse, they were broadcasting energy signatures identical to Confederation faster-than-light communication arrays. "What are those?" he demanded. Admiral Chen's smile was grim, but proud. "Those are liberation beacons, Commander. For the past 20 years, we've been building a communications network capable of coordinating simultaneous rebellion across the entire galaxy. Each beacon can reach 50-star systems instantaneously, carrying not just messages, but detailed tactical information and coordination protocols." The implications hit Zethrix like a physical blow. The humans hadn't just been preparing to defend Earth, they'd been building the infrastructure for galactic revolution. Every conquered species, every resistance movement, every suppressed independence faction would receive simultaneous coordination and support from humanity's network. "You're destroying the galactic order," Zethrix said. "We're replacing tyranny with freedom," Admiral Chen replied. "The only question now is whether you're going to help us or try to stop us." Zethrix's tactical displays erupted with new contacts. Ships were appearing throughout the system, but they weren't human vessels. The energy signatures identified them as Yolani cruisers, Endorian destroyers, Cortharian fighters, and dozens of other ship types from species supposedly pacified decades ago. The hidden fleets of conquered peoples were emerging from concealment to stand with humanity against the Confederation. "Impossible," Lieutenant Corvin whispered. "Sir, we're detecting over 300 vessels of unknown configuration. They're using outdated technology, but there are so many of them." Zethrix realized with growing horror that the humans had somehow coordinated the largest military alliance in galactic history. Every species the Confederation had conquered, every resistance movement that had been driven underground, every desperate group that still dreamed of freedom had somehow been united under human leadership. His communication console activated again, this time showing a face he hadn't seen in 40 years. Commander Thylex had been his closest friend during the Cortharian uprising, a brilliant tactician who'd supposedly died during the final defense of their homeworld. Now he appeared on screen wearing the uniform of a free Cortharian fleet commander. Zephrix, Thylex said, his voice heavy with emotion. My old friend. I've waited 40 years for this moment. Thylex, you're alive. Zephrix could barely process what he was seeing. His friend hadn't died in the bombardment. He'd somehow escaped and built a resistance fleet. Alive and free, thanks to our human allies. They found us, Zephrix. All of us. Every survivor, every resistance cell, every species that still remembers what freedom feels like. They've given us hope again. Thylex's expression grew intense. Join us, old friend. Help us break the chains the Confederation forced us to wear. Zephrix looked around his bridge at faces he'd served with for years. Corvin, whose family had died in Confederation pacification campaigns. Thrin, whose entire culture had been declared incompatible with galactic stability. Dozens of officers from conquered species who served the Confederation because they had no choice. Admiral Chen's voice cut through his confusion. Commander, you have 30 seconds to make a decision. You can order your ships to attack and begin a battle that will cost thousands of lives on both sides. Or you can do something that's never been done in Confederation history. Choose to stand with the oppressed instead of the oppressors. Zephrix's hands hovered over his weapon controls. A single command would unleash enough firepower to destroy dozens of the resistance vessels. His duty as a Confederation officer was clear and absolute. But his conscience as a Cortharian who remembered freedom was equally clear. Sir, Lieutenant Corvin asked quietly, what are your orders? Zephrix looked at the tactical display showing hundreds of ships crewed by beings whose worlds had been conquered just as his had been. Then, he looked at his own crew, mostly composed of species that served the Confederation under duress rather than choice. Finally, he looked at the image of his old friend Thylex, alive and free after 40 years of presumed death. Open a channel to the fleet, Zephrix ordered. Sir, Admiral Vakris is expecting your tactical assessment, Major Thrin warned. Open the channel, Zephrix repeated. The communication array activated, broadcasting to every Confederation vessel in his battle group. Zephrix could see the faces of his fellow commanders on the display, all of them awaiting his orders. This is Commander Zephrix to all vessels, he began, his voice carrying clearly across the tactical networks. I am officially relieving myself of command and declaring this battle group independent of Confederation authority. The shocked silence that followed was broken by Admiral Chen's voice. Welcome to the Resistance, Commander. One by one, the other Confederation commanders followed Zephrix's lead. Captain Velos of the Triumphant was a hegemony survivor whose people had been scattered across the galaxy as forced laborers. Commander Drix commanded a crew that was 90% conquered species serving in voluntary terms. Major Kell had watched her homeworld's culture be systematically erased in the name of galactic stability. Within minutes, Zephrix's entire battle group had defected to the human-led alliance. Their ships moved to join the growing fleet of resistance vessels, their weapons training on the outer system where Admiral Vakris waited with the Third Fleet. The revolution had begun. Admiral Chen opened a new communication channel, this one broadcasting on every frequency used by Confederation forces throughout the galaxy. Her image appeared on screens across hundreds of star systems, reaching millions of military personnel serving the empire that had conquered their homeworlds. People of the galaxy, she began, her voice carrying to every corner of known space. Today we begin the fight for freedom. Not just for humanity, but for every species that dreams of self-determination. The Confederation has ruled through fear and overwhelming force for millennia, but empires built on oppression carry the seeds of their own destruction. Zephrix watched his tactical displays as reports poured in from across the galaxy. Simultaneous uprisings were beginning in dozens of star systems. Confederation garrison fleets were being engaged by resistance forces that seemed to appear from nowhere. Military installations were suffering coordinated sabotage that crippled their operational capabilities. The choice before you is simple, Admiral Chen continued. Stand with the Confederation and help maintain a system of oppression that has enslaved entire civilizations. Or stand with us and help build a galaxy where every species has the right to determine its own destiny. A new voice joined the transmission, Commander Thylex speaking from his Cortharian resistance vessel. To every Cortharian serving the Confederation, this is your liberation. Your homeworld remembers your sacrifice, and we're here to bring you home. Other voices followed. Yolani commanders calling to their scattered people. Andorian leaders reaching out to military units spread across the galaxy. Representatives of dozens of conquered species offering their people a chance to serve their own civilizations instead of their conquerors. The psychological impact was devastating. Across the galaxy, Confederation military units composed primarily of conquered species faced an impossible choice between duty and freedom. Many would remain loyal to their orders, but even a small percentage of defections would cripple the Empire's ability to maintain control. Admiral Chun concluded the transmission with words that would echo across history. The Confederation has ruled through superior firepower and the fear of extinction. But they made one crucial mistake. They underestimated the power of hope. Today, hope strikes back. As the transmission ended, Zethryx received an urgent communication from Admiral Vakris. The Zinthari commander's crystalline features displayed a mixture of rage and disbelief that was terrible to behold. Commander Zethryx, you will return to formation immediately and prepare for disciplinary action. Your mutinous behavior will not be tolerated. Zethryx looked at the display showing Admiral Vakris's massive fleet, still more than capable of destroying everything in the system despite the growing Resistance Alliance. But he also saw something else, uncertainty. For the first time in Confederation history, a fleet admiral was facing organized opposition from her own forces. Admiral Vakris, Zethryx replied calmly. With all due respect, my loyalty is to my people, not to the empire that conquered them. I will not return to formation, and I will not participate in the extinction of another free species. Admiral Vakris's image wavered with rage. You have chosen treason, Commander. You will be hunted down and eliminated along with your human allies. Perhaps, Zethryx acknowledged. But, Admiral, before you begin this battle, ask yourself one question. How many of your own crew are serving the Confederation willingly? How many of them are watching this transmission and remembering their lost homeworlds? The communication ended, leaving Zethryx to contemplate what he'd done. In the space of an hour, he'd gone from loyal Confederation officer to rebel commander. The decision felt both terrifying and liberating. For the first time in 40 years, he was fighting for something he believed in rather than simply following orders. Lieutenant Corvin approached his command station, his forearms trembling with nervous energy. Sir, what are your orders? Zethryx looked at his tactical display, showing the massive Confederation fleet preparing for battle against a hodgepodge alliance of resistance vessels and defected units. The odds were still overwhelmingly against them, but for the first time since the Cortharian uprising, he felt like he was on the right side of history. Prepare for battle, Zethryx ordered, and send a message to our new allies. Today we find out what freedom is worth. The Battle of Terra began at 0347 hours Galactic Standard Time with the most devastating opening salvo in recorded military history. Admiral Vakris, commanding the Third Fleet from her flagship Galactic Dominion, launched simultaneous attacks against Earth's orbital defenses and the growing Resistance fleet. Her strategy was simple and brutal, overwhelming firepower applied without mercy to crush rebellion before it could spread further. Zethryx watched from the bridge of his cruiser Eternal Victory as space lit up with the fury of 1,000 suns. Confederation plasma cannons hurled bolts of contained stellar fire across millions of kilometers, while human defensive platforms responded with weapons no one had expected them to possess. The energy signatures were unlike anything in Confederation databases. Coherent gravitational pulses that could shred hull armor, and disruptor fields that neutralized incoming plasma streams. Where did they get this technology? Major Thren demanded from her station at Tactical Analysis. The Yalani officer's usual composure was cracking as her instruments recorded weapons that shouldn't have existed. Admiral Chin's voice came across the Resistance fleet's communication channels, calm and confident despite the hell erupting around them. All Resistance vessels, implement Protocol 7. Human defense grid is moving to full automation. Freedom fighters, show them what we learned from 40 years of Confederation oppression. Zethryx realized with growing amazement that the humans had done more than simply prepare defenses. They'd reverse-engineered 40 years of Confederation military technology and improved upon it. The orbital fortresses weren't just defensive positions. They were weapons platforms incorporating the best elements of dozens of conquered civilizations' military innovations. Lieutenant Corvin called out from his station, his forearms dancing across sensor arrays with desperate efficiency. Sir, the human defensive network is operating as a single coordinated entity. They're sharing targeting data across their entire grid in real time. Every weapons platform has access to the combined sensor data of the whole system. The implications were staggering. Instead of hundreds of individual defensive positions that could be overwhelmed one by one, the Confederation faced a unified defensive entity that grew stronger as more platforms came online. It was military coordination on a scale that even the Confederation had never achieved. Admiral Vakrus's response was predictably brutal. Her dreadnought alone mounted enough firepower to sterilize a continent, and she brought it to bear on the largest human orbital fortress with the fury of someone whose authority had been challenged for the first time in her career. The fortress died in a brilliant explosion that lit up half the system, but its destruction triggered something unexpected. The remaining defensive platforms didn't waver or fall back. They coordinated an immediate counterattack that focused the combined firepower of dozens of installations on the Galactic Dominion. Zethryx watched in disbelief as Admiral Vakrus's flagship, the most advanced vessel in the Confederation fleet, staggered under the coordinated assault. Her shields held, but the fact that a collection of primitive defensive platforms could threaten a dreadnought was unprecedented in galactic military history. Commander Thylex's voice cut through the tactical chatter on resistance frequencies. All Cortharian units, execute redemption pattern. Let's show them what 40 years of exile taught us about warfare. The Cortharian resistance fleet moved with precision that made Zethryx's chest swell with forgotten pride. His people had been master tacticians before their conquest, and their years in exile had only honed their skills. Their outdated vessels might lack the firepower of modern Confederation ships, but they moved with the fluid coordination of a school of predatory fish. The resistance strategy became clear as Zethryx watched the battle develop. They weren't trying to match the Confederation ship for ship. They were using mobility and coordination to multiply their effective strength. Human orbital platforms provided covering fire while resistance vessels conducted hit and run attacks, never staying in one place long enough for Confederation targeting systems to achieve locks. But the most devastating aspect of the battle wasn't the exchange of weapons fire. It was what was happening aboard Confederation vessels throughout the fleet. Admiral Chin's transmission had reached every ship, and the response was becoming visible on tactical displays as vessels began breaking formation or reducing their rate of fire. "Sir," Lieutenant Corvin reported, his voice tight with disbelief, "we're detecting mutinies aboard 17 Confederation vessels. Captain Morvek's cruiser just opened fire on Admiral Vakrus's escort destroyers." Captain Morvek was a hegemony survivor whose entire family had died in Confederation pacification campaigns. His decision to turn his weapons on his own fleet was being replicated throughout Admiral Vakrus's command as officers from conquered species chose revolution over continued service to their oppressors. Admiral Vakrus's response was swift and merciless. Confederation vessels that showed signs of mutiny were immediately targeted by their own fleetmates. The civil war within the Third Fleet was almost as destructive as the battle with human forces, as Confederation officers found themselves fighting on three fronts simultaneously. Zethryx realized he was witnessing the collapse of the system that had maintained galactic order for millennia. The Confederation's strength had always rested on the assumption that conquered species would remain loyal out of necessity, if not affection. The humans had shattered that assumption by offering an alternative that millions of oppressed beings found irresistible. A new voice joined the Resistance Communications Network, Admiral Chin speaking from what appeared to be a mobile command center. "All forces, prepare for Phase 2. Liberation fleets, you are cleared to begin offensive operations." Zethryx's tactical display suddenly erupted with new contacts as ships began emerging from hyperspace throughout the system. But these weren't the ragtag resistance vessels he'd expected. They were modern Confederation warships flying the colors of their original civilizations. Somehow, the humans had convinced entire fleet elements to defect and join their cause. The psychological impact on Admiral Vakrus's forces was immediate and catastrophic. Facing rebellion from within their own ranks was one thing, but confronting modern Confederation technology in the hands of their former victims was something no one had prepared for. "How is this possible?" Major Thrin whispered as her sensors identified a full battle squadron of advanced cruisers flying Yolani sovereignty flags. Those ships were supposed to be destroyed years ago. Commander Thylex provided the answer on the Resistance Network. "The humans found us, but they also found something else. Confederation officers who'd grown sick of serving an empire built on oppression. Sympathizers who've been secretly preserving ships and supplies for the day when resistance became possible." The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking. For decades, while the Confederation believed it had absolute control over galactic military forces, a shadow network had been preserving equipment and personnel for eventual rebellion. The humans hadn't just inspired existing resistance movements. They'd activated sleeper cells that had been in place for generations. Admiral Vakrus's voice cut across all communication frequencies, her crystalline features distorted with rage and disbelief. All Confederation vessels, this is Admiral Vakrus. Any ship that does not immediately return to formation and engage the rebels will be considered hostile and destroyed without warning. Her threat was immediately tested as 3 more cruisers broke formation to join the resistance fleet. Admiral Vakrus's response was swift. The Galactic Dominion's massive guns turned on the defecting vessels and reduced them to expanding clouds of plasma and debris. The message was clear. The Confederation would destroy its own forces rather than allow rebellion to succeed. But the brutal response only accelerated the rate of defection as officers throughout the fleet realized they faced a choice between revolution and serving an empire that would murder them for hesitation. Zephrix found himself coordinating with species he'd helped conquer, working alongside former enemies who were now united by common cause. The irony wasn't lost on him. The Confederation's policy of using conquered peoples to police other conquered peoples had created a military force with intimate knowledge of imperial tactics and deep resentment of imperial authority. "Sir," Lieutenant Corvin called out urgently. "Admiral Vakrus is concentrating her remaining loyal forces for a direct assault on Earth's surface. She's abandoning the space battle to prevent human leadership from escaping." Zephrix realized with horror that Admiral Vakrus had decided that if she couldn't maintain galactic order, she would at least complete humanity's extermination. Her remaining ships were moving to orbital bombardment positions, preparing to glass Earth's surface regardless of the cost to her own forces. Admiral Chen's voice came across the network with deadly calm. "All resistance forces, execute final protocol. Earth defense grid, initiate in-game scenario." This is not a drill. The orbital defenses around Earth suddenly changed configuration, revealing weapons that had been hidden throughout the battle. Massive installations that had appeared to be destroyed came back online, while new platforms emerged from concealment in asteroid fields and Lagrange points. The humans had been holding back their true defensive capabilities, waiting for exactly this moment. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. The human defense grid suddenly expanded beyond Earth's orbital space, as similar platforms activated around Luna, Mars, and the outer planets. The humans hadn't just fortified their homeworld, they'd turned their entire star system into a defensive network of unprecedented complexity. Zephrix watched his tactical displays with growing awe as the true scope of human preparation became visible. For 20 years, while the Confederation believed humanity was a primitive species barely capable of interplanetary travel, they'd been building military infrastructure that rivaled anything in galactic history. Admiral Vakrus's bombardment fleet found itself trapped in a crossfire that would have been impossible to escape even at full strength. But her forces were depleted by defections and battle damage, while facing defensive systems that had been specifically designed to counter Confederation tactics. The final irony came when Admiral Vakrus herself faced mutiny aboard her flagship. The Galactic Dominion's crew was primarily composed of conquered species who'd been listening to Admiral Chen's transmissions and watching their admiral's willingness to destroy her own forces rather than accept defeat. Commander Thylex's voice carried across the Resistance network one final time. "Admiral Vakrus, this is Commander Thylex of the Free Cortharian Fleet. You are surrounded by forces loyal to freedom rather than oppression. Surrender now and you will be treated according to the laws of civilized warfare." The response came in the form of the Galactic Dominion's self-destruct sequence. Rather than face defeat, Admiral Vakrus chose to die with her ship and take as many enemies as possible with her. The massive explosion lit up half the system, but the shockwave was contained by human gravitational manipulators that turned the Dreadnought's death into a spectacular but harmless light show. In the aftermath of the battle, Zephrix found himself aboard the human command station, meeting with Admiral Chun and the leadership of the Resistance Alliance. The scope of their victory was becoming clear as reports poured in from across the galaxy. Simultaneous uprisings had succeeded in dozens of star systems, while Confederation forces faced mass defection and coordinated resistance on a scale that made central control impossible. "Commander Zephrix," Admiral Chin said, offering him a seat at the conference table where the leaders of a dozen species were planning the future of galactic civilization. Welcome to the Galactic Liberation Alliance. We have a lot of work to do. Zephrix looked around the table at faces that represented civilizations the Confederation had tried to erase. Cortharians like himself, Yolani philosophers, hegemony engineers, and Dorian artists, all working together to build something that had never existed in galactic history, a government based on cooperation rather than conquest. What happens now? Zephrix asked. Admiral Chun smiled, and, for the first time since he'd met her, the expression was entirely peaceful. Now we build something better. A galaxy where strength protects freedom instead of destroying it. A civilization where diversity is celebrated instead of eliminated. A future where no species ever again has to choose between slavery and extinction. As Zephrix listened to the planning sessions for the new galactic order, he realized that humanity had accomplished something unprecedented. They hadn't just defeated the Confederation militarily. They provided a vision of the future that made billions of beings willing to risk everything for the chance of freedom. The Battle of Terra was over, but the war for galactic liberation had just begun. 1 year after the Battle of Terra, Commander Zephrix stood in the observation deck of the orbital station New Korthak, watching his homeworld's sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson that he hadn't seen since childhood. The orbital bombardment platforms that had enforced Confederation rule were gone, replaced by civilian habitats and research stations that served his people's interests rather than their conquerors. The transformation hadn't been easy. The collapse of the Confederation had left a power vacuum across 60% of known space, while the remaining Imperial loyalists had retreated to fortified sectors where they continued to resist the spreading liberation movement. What followed had been a year of the most complex military and diplomatic campaign in galactic history, as the human-led alliance worked to build a new civilization from the ashes of the old. Zephrix's personal transformation had been equally dramatic. No longer a reluctant servant of Imperial authority, he now commanded the Cortharian Defense Fleet as part of the broader Galactic Liberation Alliance. His ships patrolled space lanes to protect trade and prevent the return of Imperial forces, but they did so in service of his own people's freely chosen government. The communication chime interrupted his contemplation, and Admiral Chin's familiar image appeared on the holographic display. She was speaking from the new Alliance headquarters on Luna, where representatives of 87 liberated species worked together to coordinate the growing coalition of free worlds. Commander Zephrix. Admiral Chun greeted him with the warmth that had become characteristic of their professional relationship. I hope you're ready for some interesting news. Zephrix had learned to be wary of Admiral Chin's definition of interesting. The human admiral had a talent for understatement that often preceded announcements of galaxy-changing significance. What's the situation, Admiral? We've received a surrender proposal from Sector Command 7. Admiral Korvash wants to negotiate the peaceful transition of 43 star systems to Alliance authority. Admiral Chen's smile carried a mixture of satisfaction and amazement. That would bring the total number of liberated worlds to over 600. The numbers were staggering. In less than 12 months, the liberation movement had grown from a desperate alliance of resistance groups into the dominant political force in the galaxy. The Confederation still controlled approximately 30% of inhabited space, but their territory was shrinking daily as more worlds chose freedom over Imperial rule. What are Admiral Korvash's terms? Zephrix asked, though he suspected he already knew. The pattern of Confederation surrenders had become predictable as Imperial commanders realized their situation was hopeless. Standard package, Admiral Chun confirmed. Amnesty for all personnel who transition peacefully to Alliance service, protection for Imperial civilians who choose to remain in liberated territory, and guaranteed autonomy for all species within his sector. She paused, consulting notes that appeared on her display. He's also offering complete access to Confederation military archives and intelligence databases. Zephrix felt a familiar mixture of satisfaction and sadness at another Imperial surrender. Each victory brought more worlds into the Alliance's growing family of free civilizations, but it also represented the final collapse of the system he'd served for 40 years. Whatever its faults, the Confederation had provided stability and order across the galaxy. The challenge now was building something better to replace it. There's something else, Admiral Chun continued, her expression growing more serious. Our intelligence services have located the Emperor. That announcement sent ice through Zephrix's veins. Emperor Malthus had been the supreme authority of the Confederation for over 2 centuries, ruling from the hidden capital world of Nexus Prime. His location had been one of the galaxy's most closely guarded secrets, known only to the highest levels of Imperial command. If the Alliance had found him, it meant they were closer to ending the war than anyone had dared hope. Where is he? Fortress World Epsilon, in the darkened nebula. He's surrounded by what remains of the Imperial Guard and approximately 200 of the most advanced warships in the former Confederation fleet. Admiral Chen's image was replaced by tactical displays showing a heavily fortified star system shrouded in cosmic dust clouds. It's essentially an impregnable stronghold, and he's using it as a base to coordinate the remaining Loyalist forces. Zethryx studied the defensive positions with professional interest. Fortress World Epsilon was legendary among Confederation military personnel, a planet-sized military installation built inside a nebula that interfered with most forms of detection and communication. Attacking it would be like assaulting a fortress while blindfolded, against defenders who knew every asteroid and dust cloud in the region. What's the Alliance Council's decision? Zethryx asked. Admiral Chen's expression grew thoughtful. That's why I'm calling you. The Council is divided. Half want to organize a massive assault to end Imperial resistance once and for all. The other half prefer to maintain the siege and wait for internal collapse. She leaned forward, her gaze intense. But there's a third option that requires someone with your unique qualifications. Zethryx realized he was about to be asked to undertake another mission that would fundamentally change his life. Admiral Chen had a talent for identifying moments when individual choices could alter the course of galactic history. Explain. We want you to go to Fortress World Epsilon alone, as a diplomatic envoy representing the interests of formerly conquered species. Your mission would be to offer Emperor Malthus the opportunity to surrender with dignity and help transition the remaining Imperial territories to Alliance authority. The audacity of the proposal was breathtaking. Emperor Malthus was the architect of the system that had enslaved Zethryx's people and countless others. The idea of offering him amnesty in exchange for surrender would be controversial enough to split the Alliance Council. But sending a former Imperial officer to make the offer added layers of complexity that bordered on insanity. Admiral, the Emperor will never trust a former Confederation commander. And the Alliance Council will never approve amnesty for the architect of galactic oppression. Zethryx paused, considering the political implications. Unless there's something you're not telling me. Admiral Chen's smile was sad, but determined. There's always something I'm not telling you, Commander. In this case, it's that Emperor Malthus specifically requested to speak with you. The revelation hit Zethryx like a physical blow. The Emperor of the Confederation, the being whose authority he'd served for 40 years without ever meeting, wanted a personal conversation with a relatively minor military commander from a conquered world. The implications were staggering and completely incomprehensible. Why me? We don't know. The message came through what remains of the Imperial Diplomatic Network 3 days ago. It was addressed specifically to Commander Zethryx of Korthak Prime, formerly of the Confederation Navy, currently serving the Liberation Alliance. He knows exactly who you are and what choices you've made. Zethryx felt the weight of galactic history settling on his shoulders. Whatever Emperor Malthus wanted to discuss, it was important enough to risk exposure of his hidden fortress and significant enough to request a specific individual from among billions of potential Alliance representatives. If I go, what authority would I have to negotiate? Admiral Chen consulted another display, this one showing what appeared to be an official Alliance Council resolution. Full diplomatic immunity and complete negotiating authority up to and including offers of amnesty, territorial concessions, and guaranteed safe passage for Imperial civilians. She looked directly at him. Basically, whatever you think is necessary to end this war without further bloodshed. The responsibility was enormous. Zethryx would be empowered to make decisions that would affect the future of every species in the galaxy. The wrong choice could lead to renewed warfare that might last for decades, while the right approach could secure peace and allow the Alliance to focus on building rather than fighting. 3 days later, Zethryx found himself aboard a small diplomatic vessel approaching the edge of the darkened nebula. The modified courier ship Peacekeeper had been equipped with the most advanced stealth technology the Alliance possessed, but he still felt exposed as they entered the cosmic dust clouds that concealed Fortress World Epsilon. The journey through the nebula was like traveling through a three-dimensional maze where the walls constantly shifted. Sensor readings were largely useless in the electromagnetic chaos, while navigation required constant course corrections to avoid collision with hidden asteroids and debris fields. It was the perfect location for a hidden fortress, assuming the defenders could find their way around better than attacking forces. Imperial patrol vessels intercepted them within 6 hours of entering the nebula, but their appearance was more ceremonial than threatening. The sleek destroyers that escorted the peacekeeper through the defensive perimeter flew the personal colors of Emperor Malthus himself, suggesting this meeting was of the highest importance to the remaining Imperial government. Fortress World Epsilon emerged from the cosmic dust like a metallic planet surrounded by artificial rings of defensive stations. The scale was overwhelming even by Confederation standards, a military installation the size of a world, capable of supporting millions of personnel and thousands of vessels. It represented the accumulated military technology of a 1,000-year empire, all focused on a single impregnable stronghold. The landing bay where they docked could have accommodated a battle fleet, but it held only a few dozen vessels bearing Imperial markings. The absence of the massive fleets that should have filled such a space was a stark reminder of how much the Confederation had lost in the past year of warfare. Emperor Malthus received Zethryx in a chamber that managed to be both magnificent and somber. The walls displayed holographic images of the Confederation at its height, thousands of worlds united under Imperial authority, trade networks spanning the galaxy, and the peace that had existed under centralized rule. But the images also showed the cost. Conquered peoples serving their conquerors, resistance movements brutally suppressed, and entire species relocated or eliminated in the name of stability. The Emperor himself was smaller than Zethryx had expected. The being who had ruled the galaxy for 2 centuries appeared aged beyond his years, his crystalline Zinthary features dimmed by exhaustion and something that looked remarkably like regret. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of authority diminished by the burden of failure. "Commander Zethryx," Emperor Malthus said, rising from his throne to greet his guest as an equal rather than a subject. "Thank you for accepting my invitation. I realize the risk you've taken in coming here." Zethryx offered the formal bow due to a head of state, though he no longer considered himself bound by Confederation protocol. "Your Majesty, I serve as a representative of the Galactic Liberation Alliance. I'm authorized to discuss terms for the peaceful resolution of this conflict." Emperor Malthus gestured for Zethryx to take a seat across from him, creating an atmosphere more suited to conversation between colleagues than negotiation between enemies. "Before we discuss terms, Commander, I want to understand something. Why did you choose rebellion? You had achieved rank and respect within the Confederation. Your people were safe under Imperial protection. What drove you to risk everything for an uncertain cause?" The question struck at the heart of Zethryx's personal transformation over the past year. He'd asked himself the same thing countless times, trying to understand the moment when duty became rebellion and service became resistance. "Your Majesty, with respect, my people were never safe under Imperial protection. They were hostages. The Confederation's peace was built on the threat of extinction for any species that dared to seek self-determination." Zethryx met the Emperor's gaze directly. "When the humans offered an alternative to that system, I realized I'd been serving fear rather than justice." Emperor Malthus nodded slowly, his expression suggesting the answer had confirmed something he already suspected. "The humans," he repeated thoughtfully. "I underestimated them catastrophically. I assumed they were another primitive species that could be easily integrated or eliminated. I failed to understand that they represented something genuinely new in galactic history." "What did they represent, Your Majesty?" "Hope," Emperor Malthus replied simply. "For the first time in millennia, they offered conquered peoples something other than submission or death. They provided a vision of galactic civilization based on cooperation rather than domination." He still